Can you believe it? A nation facing severe food shortages has chosen to bury 100 tons of watermelons beneath the burning sands of the Sahel. Not weapons, not imported fertilizers, but the very sweet, juicy fruit we slice at summer barbecues. The image made the world laugh. Western headlines sneered, "Burkina Faso buries its breakfast." Analysts shook their heads, dismissing it as waste, some even calling it a political stunt. But President Ibrahim Traoré gave it another name, Project Oasis. He declared, "Every watermelon buried is not a lost meal, but a seed of sovereignty." So what is really happening here? Why would a hungry nation embrace such a seemingly absurd act? And could 100 tons of buried melons become a weapon strong enough to challenge a billion-dollar global industry? In the next moments, you'll discover why the world first laughed and then began to fear. Why would a nation bury food? The answer hides beneath the sand. At first glance, the burial of watermelons looked like madness, a desperate show to mask hunger. But the deeper you dig, the more the logic begins to reveal itself. Burkina Faso has long been chained not only by drought, but by dependency. Every planting season, the nation's farmers wait on shipments of chemical fertilizers, shipments that arrive late, cost too much, and come attached to invisible strings of foreign corporations. If the trucks don't come, if the contracts are delayed, harvests fail and families starve. Sovereignty becomes nothing more than paperwork signed in distant capitals. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this cycle was intolerable. The nation could not claim independence if its soil remained hostage to imports. The question was, could Burkina Faso break free with something it already had in abundance? The surprising answer was the watermelon. To most of us, it's just a fruit, a moment of joy, laughter for children, relief from the heat. But to agronomists, a watermelon is a biological treasure, 90% water, rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and carbon-rich pulp. Buried whole, a watermelon becomes more than food. It becomes an underground reservoir, a slow-release water tank, and a starter kit for life in soil that has long forgotten how to breathe. Here lies Reveal. Number 2. The science behind the symbolism. Local scientists began running controlled experiments. In untreated plots, soil moisture vanished within 4 days under the Sahel sun. But in plots where surplus melons were buried, measurable moisture remained after 2 full weeks. Seedlings of millet and sorghum germinated faster. Their roots dug deeper, anchoring themselves in soil that had been dead for years. Even microbial life, tiny organisms long thought extinct in this region, started to return. The results were modest, but the symbolism was immense. What looked like waste was, in fact, a low-tech adaptation strategy. Instead of begging for fertilizer imports, Burkina Faso was harnessing its own surplus, turning spoiled or unsellable melons into tools of ecological recovery. And there was another layer. Across West African markets, mountains of watermelons often rot in the sun or clog border checkpoints when traders can't find buyers. By mobilizing these forgotten fruits, Project Oasis solved 2 problems at once: waste management and soil degradation. What had been a burden became an asset. Of course, critics pushed back. They argued that surplus melons were too limited to restore vast farmlands, that decomposition might attract pests, that nutrients would be uneven. But supporters countered that the point was not to replace every fertilizer bag with a melon. The point was to prove a principle, that Africa could repurpose its own resources, however humble, instead of waiting endlessly for aid trucks from abroad. President Traoré himself said it bluntly in a national address. If the world will not sell us fertilizers without chains, then we will make our own fertility from what the earth already gives us. This statement reframed the entire debate. It was no longer about fruit rotting in the ground. It was about sovereignty, about refusing to live forever in a system designed to keep nations dependent. And so, we arrive at a new, sharper question. If a single fruit, dismissed as a summer snack, can alter the fate of barren soil, what else might be possible? Could mango waste, citrus peels, or peanut shells become the next tools of liberation? Before we explore the answer, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the story you're hearing now, ridiculed by some, feared by others, may be remembered tomorrow as the spark that changed the Sahel forever. From laughter to shock, the world reacts to Burkina Faso's watermelon revolution. The moment the first green shoots appeared above the desert floor, the reactions were immediate and deeply divided. Inside Burkina Faso, rural villages near the test sites became gathering points for both hope and suspicion. Children clapped and giggled as each melon disappeared into the ground, singing playful chants about planting water. For them, it was an adventure, a miracle unfolding in front of their eyes. Elders, however, watched with quiet solemnity. Some whispered that Project Oasis echoed ancient traditions, when offerings of milk or calabashes of grain were buried in the soil to call for rain. To them, it was not science or politics. It was ritual returning in modern form. But not everyone shared this reverence. In Ouagadougou's crowded markets, vendors fumed. Hundreds of melons that could have been sold cheaply in the city were instead consigned to the sand. Mothers on radio talk shows demanded answers. How can we bury food when our children go to bed hungry? Opposition politicians seized the discontent, branding the project as reckless waste. And yet, only 2 weeks later, Reveal Number 3 silenced some of the outrage. In the test plots where melons had been buried, something extraordinary happened. Millet and cowpea seedlings sprouted in places where nothing had grown for years. Farmers touched the soil with their hands and whispered, "It feels alive again." Local media ran photographs of fragile green shoots piercing the dust, and suddenly the tone shifted. What had been dismissed as spectacle was now visible evidence. The desert, it seemed, could breathe again. The reaction spread quickly across borders. In Mali, radio programs buzzed with callers asking whether their own surplus baobab pulp or peanut shells could be used the same way. In Niger, agricultural students held forums, calling Project Oasis the science of the poor, by the poor. In Chad, community leaders praised the symbolism. If Burkina Faso can plant water in the sand, then perhaps we can plant hope as well. For the first time in decades, regional solidarity was not based on aid convoys or foreign summits, but on a local experiment carried out with spoiled fruit. Internationally, the divide was even sharper. French newspapers mocked the initiative with cartoons of villagers pelting the desert with fruit. British anchors called it a desperate stunt by a desperate regime. American analysts dismissed it as unscientific, unsustainable, and unserious. But outside the Western press, the story sounded very different. Russian broadcasters hailed President Traoré as a leader unafraid to challenge dependency. Chinese agricultural journals praised the project as an ingenious form of recycling organic waste. Turkish outlets applauded its cultural resonance, framing it as a dignified local solution rooted in tradition. In just weeks, Project Oasis had become more than an experiment. It was now a mirror reflecting two worlds, one that ridiculed and one that respected. To some, it was proof of failure. To others, it was proof of freedom. And within that divide lies the real question: who gets to define what counts as progress in Africa? Is it the critics sitting in distant capitals, or the farmers kneeling in the dust, touching soil that has come back to life? I want to hear your thoughts. If you were a farmer in Burkina Faso, would you see buried melons as waste or as hope? Comment below. And let's see whose vision of the future speaks louder. Shocking leak: when watermelons became a threat to the global fertilizer empire. Just as fragile green shoots began to cover soil once thought permanently dead, many believed the story had found its happy ending. The land revived, the people inspired, and the project vindicated. But at that very moment, a revelation exploded that would change everything. One evening, a leaked document surfaced online, allegedly an internal memo from a European Agricultural Trade Association. The language inside was blunt, borderline panicked. It warned that if Burkina Faso's watermelon burial experiment truly worked, the fertilizer market across West Africa could collapse. Billions of dollars in annual revenue, decades of contracts, supply chains, and carefully built political influence could all be undone by discarded fruit buried in sand. But the memo went further. It proposed a counter-strategy: discredit the science, amplify images of waste, and frame the project as reckless. Media partners were urged to circulate photos of hungry children standing beside piles of buried melons, crafting outrage and ridicule with a single purpose: kill the idea before it could spread. Within days, the global media narrative shifted exactly as scripted. Where once there had been mocking cartoons, now came harsher accusations. Op-eds declared Project Oasis is a fraud to mask corruption. Commentators alleged secret deals to destabilize fertilizer markets. Think tanks warned of manipulation, propaganda, even collusion. Inside Burkina Faso, the effect was electric. Radio hosts read excerpts of the leaked memo on air. Villagers began to wonder aloud, had they been deceived? Opposition leaders demanded an inquiry. Protesters in Ouagadougou raised signs that read, "Where is our food? Where is the truth?" And yet, for many ordinary citizens, the memo had the opposite effect. If powerful corporations were this terrified, perhaps the melons were not useless after all. Perhaps they were dangerous not to the people, but to those who had long profited from Africa's dependency. Social media erupted. Memes spread like wildfire, watermelons breaking chains, slogans declaring "Fear the fruit." The project was no longer just about agriculture. It had become a battle of symbols between a small nation daring to rise and the empires determined to hold it down. And so the cliffhanger emerges. Are these fragile green shoots genuine proof of a sustainable future, or just an illusion inflated beyond reality? What about you? If you saw that leaked memo with your own eyes, would you trust the Western media's version of the story, or the living soil rising again from the dust? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Science strikes back. The proof they didn't want you to see. After weeks of ridicule, anger, and doubt, the moment of reckoning finally arrived. Independent scientists, invited by Burkina Faso, but operating with full transparency, released their preliminary findings. And the numbers were impossible to ignore. In plots treated with buried melons, soil moisture remained measurable after 14 days without rain, compared to just 4 days in untreated control plots. Millet seedlings germinated faster and pushed roots nearly twice as deep by the 3rd week. Microbial activity, measured by respiration tests, surged by 35%, suggesting that soil long pronounced dead was now breathing again. The government quickly seized the momentum. Ministers held press conferences with photographs displayed side by side, barren dust in one frame, fragile green shoots in the other. This is not theater, one official declared. This is science, measured in roots and moisture, not rumors. This was reveal number 4, and it hit like thunder. Citizens who had doubted felt pride swelling in their chests. For the first time in years, they could point to evidence that their land, long written off as hopeless, could still respond to care. But critics were not silent. Western headlines pushed back hard. Fertilizer lobbyists argued that the results were irrelevant because they were too small to scale. Think tanks released papers declaring a handful of plots cannot feed a nation. Some even claimed that relying on fruit decomposition was dangerous, unpredictable, and ultimately unsustainable. Burkina Faso's response was sharp and unapologetic. Officials reminded the world that no agricultural revolution ever began overnight. The Green Revolution, they pointed out, had started with tiny test plots of wheat and rice. If melons can awaken our soil, they said, why should that not be the beginning of our own green revolution? And here lies the deeper truth. Project Oasis was never about replacing every bag of fertilizer with fruit. It was about proving a principle. Africa does not have to wait endlessly for imports stamped with foreign logos. The continent can build fertility with what it already has. Watermelons were not the end game. They were only the beginning. This reframing shifted the debate yet again. Suddenly, the burial of fruit was no longer just about survival. It was about sovereignty. It was about turning waste into wealth, despair into possibility. Still, the question remained, if the world mocked, and the corporations panicked, and the soil itself whispered back with green life, who should people believe? And now I ask you, faced with science on one side and fear-mongering on the other, whose story would you trust? Comment below. I want to know which vision of the future you stand with. From wasted fruit to national freedom, the people who made melons a revolution. By the second year of Project Oasis, the story was no longer just about government policy. It had become a movement. And movements are built not only in laboratories or parliaments, but in the hands of ordinary people. Take Miriam, a single mother in the northern province of Yatenga. For years, she struggled to keep her children fed, often borrowing money just to buy fertilizer for her tiny plot. But when she joined a women's cooperative that collected spoiled melons from local markets, everything changed. The group buried the fruit in shallow pits and mixed the pulp with crop residue to enrich the soil. That season, Miriam saved nearly 20% on agricultural expenses. With the money she kept, she bought school supplies for her children. Holding up a worn notebook, she told a local reporter, "This melon gave us this." Or consider Adama, a former soldier who had spent years guarding remote outposts against insurgents. When he returned home, he found his village parched and hopeless. Instead of leaving again, he joined a team monitoring the melon burial sites. On a community radio program, his voice broke as he said, "We once guarded borders. Now we guard the ground that feeds our children." His story resonated with veterans across the nation. Project Oasis was not only about soil, but about restoring purpose. These are not isolated cases. Across Burkina Faso, women's groups organized melon days, gathering spoiled fruit that would otherwise rot and channeling it into burial pits. Agricultural extension workers trained them in simple composting techniques, combining melon pulp with millet husks or ground nut shells to create richer, longer-lasting fertilizers. The cooperatives sold seedlings to neighboring villages, reinvesting the profits into wells, schools, and even small solar panels. What began as waste management evolved into women-led microeconomies. Children, too, became part of the story. Teachers in Bobo Dioulasso designed lessons around Project Oasis, explaining that a watermelon was not just food, but a reservoir of life. Students carried baskets of melons to demonstration fields, each child allowed to place one fruit into the ground. They called it planting water. Years later, those same children would remember not only the science, but the symbolism that even something fragile could restore hope when used wisely. Meanwhile, agronomists pushed the project further. They began experimenting with integrated methods, burying melons alongside biochar to lock in carbon, using melon pits as moisture anchors for drought-resistant trees like moringa and acacia, intercropping with legumes to fix nitrogen. The results were encouraging. Fields treated with these integrated methods showed 30% higher yields after just one season.